I'm particularly pleased indeed that we've been able to attract our next presenter to give us our opening plenary session here today at the conference. Professor Bryan heidorn from the University of Arizona will be talking to us today on repository as app, functionality to attract dark data. Of course, I'm not going to attempt in any way to talk about his presentation or introduce it, because he'll do that far better than I possibly could. But I just want to give you a little background to Bryan's biography. Bryan holds a degree in biology and a PhD in information science. He was an owner of a software company specializing in chemical tracking and environmental monitoring. And he was an associate professor for 12 years at the University of Illinois Graduate School of Library and Information Science, and served 2 years as program manager in the National Science Foundation Division of Biological Infrastructure, where he served in several programs, including advances in biological informatics, cyber-enabled discovery and innovation, and the Data Working Group. He's now director of the School of Information Resources and Library Science at the University of Arizona and president of the JRS Biodiversity Foundation. His research areas include biodiversity informatics, data curation, natural language processing, and machine learning. It's a great pleasure to introduce you to Professor Bryan heidorn and to ask him to address us this morning. Okay. Oh, good. Thank you. The microphone? Yes, it's working. Okay. You notice I changed it from repository as app to app as repository, and that's going to be part of the story of this morning. Whoops, I'm left-handed, and the mouse hasn't been reversed. So this is where I'm coming from. This is University of Arizona, or near the University of Arizona. I don't actually work there. So the main thesis is that there's large amounts of data that are currently uncurated, and you all know that. But my argument is that most of the data is from small data sets, and it's not currently being properly managed and is essentially invisible, and I call that dark data. And I'll discuss a little bit what the characteristics of dark data are. And that data should be curated, at least initially, locally, but it shouldn't be done by the scientists in any explicit way, because scientists should be busy being scientists, except for computational scientists, which should deal with the data more explicitly. Okay, the problem is that it's largely unsolved information. We don't have acceptable formats for this dark data, and that it's not being addressed by the computer scientists and information scientists and others as much as it should be. Some projects being presented here, looking at the agenda, will talk about this problem. I'm going to present different ones here, different projects that are dealing with it, as an example of the approach. So this is singing to the choir, so all of you know about most of these publications. Acknowledgement that we're about to undergo a data deluge, or the data deluge is already occurring, and how do we cope with it? And I'm going to say that the supercomputer, or the HPC, is needed for small data as much as it's needed for large data. So I think I'll skip by these primarily. I have many slides. Don't panic if I skip by. They'll be available online. But I think most of you have seen these before: long-lived data collections, and others that have come out of NSF and other areas. But what we want to talk about is dark data is data that we know is there, but we can't see it. So it's just like dark matter. So this is a picture from the Hubble telescope, and we see that the dark ring there is actually something that is there. It looks like it's not there, but it's dark data, or dark matter. So how do we measure it? How do we get at how much of it there is in the universe? How much dark data is there in the universe? I'm going to argue that, the animation didn't work. Okay, that's okay. That we can that we have a power law distribution in science. So this is just the power law formula, and that data is distributed along this, that our big data projects are on the left-hand side of the curve, and they're very important, generate lots of important information in advanced science. The question is, what's happening under the long tail of science? And the important point is, what's the volume of the tail, the volume underneath? This comes out of economics, the long tail economics. For a long time, the example, Anderson did this work in Wired, or made it popular in Wired magazine a few years ago now. But people noticed that when you had storefronts like Blockbuster, I don't know if you have Blockbuster here? People used to get DVDs and VCR tapes from those stores. And the floor space was very, very expensive. So the name of the store is Blockbusters because what you could get there was Blockbusters. The things that would rent very fast, that's what you put on the floor. Other companies came along later when the internet was invented, or a little while after that, and realized that you didn't need floor space, and that changed the economics. So where it used to be that you would make your money by selling on the left-hand side of this curve, those companies were able, because of the internet, to focus on the right-hand side of the curve and the volume under that curve. And it turns out that there were many more people that wanted to rent documentaries as a class than wanted to rent the blockbusters. So you could have a high volume of 2 or 3 titles, or you could have several thousand titles with a much lower volume and make more money. But we haven't done that yet in science. So is it valid? Is science data really distributed this way? Should have changed this to a left-handed mouse. So GenBank, for me in biology, GenBank, the protein data bank, I would argue is on the left-hand side. So well-managed, large volume data sets. So what about the tail? Do we have any evidence? And having worked at NSF, I was able to get my hands on the financial records. I'm going to show you 2007, 2008, and 2009 follow pretty much the same curve. So we don't measure how much data is coming out of NSF, but we do measure very carefully, because we're a government agency, how many dollars are coming out of NSF. And what we can say is that, or I can make the hypothesis that $1 will buy me X bytes. I don't know how many bytes, it doesn't matter, because I only care about the shape of the curve, not the actual content. And indeed, this is a distribution of funding out of NSF. So almost 10,000 projects plotted here, sorted by the number of dollars being invested in that project. And we see that there's a small number of very large projects in that year, one receiving $7 million. And then a few more in the millions of dollars, but then it very quickly tails off. And we have this long tail phenomenon where you have many, many smaller projects, but that's where most of the dollars are going. And if we look at that year's distribution, so I just broke it up, 20%, top 20%, and bottom 80, we see about half the money is going to those smaller projects. But we aren't investing in e-research as much, and few vendors. Just look at the size of that market. So those small projects, all the money to be made out there, if you just focus on them. So most of those projects are $350,000 US or less, which is relatively small if you're talking about who's working on the project. You have your PI, you have a graduate student probably, and the graduate student is going to be the one that's managing the data coming out of the project, which is probably not the most professional way to do science. So how do we deal with that? So the question is, if you're a scientist working in that data, where's your data now? And if you think about it, unless you're using a telescope or a very large instrumentation project, large instrumentation project, it's mainly being stored on your desktop or your bottom. After the project's over, it goes on some device and goes in your bottom left-hand desk drawer, where it's very dark. So is that data working, or is it on the dole? Is it being useful right now? So what is a data scientist anyway, and what should the data scientist be doing? Most of you as data scientists here, this is a large collection of them, is focusing on the left-hand side of the tail, of the curve. What about the tail? So the data in the tail tends to be more heterogeneous, and I would argue has higher information content and entropy. So if you think of it from the point of view of information science and information theory, we have a lot more variability within the small data sets. That makes them hard to handle. But it also, the information content, the difference between data and information, the information content could be much higher than the homogeneous data sets coming off telescopes and those sorts of things. So the job of the data scientist in that realm is to find the dark data or the hidden data, or better, to not lose it in the first place. So how is it that we can integrate ourselves into the science in the tail so that the data is properly managed from the beginning? We should be evaluating the usefulness of the data. We don't keep all data, just like we don't in big science. Or better, rather than evaluating ourselves, create metrics so that the scientists in the community, just like we curate journal articles, can decide what data should be kept and what data should be thrown away. Organization, metadata, and format. Or better, we should allow multiple views of the same data, because we can't always predict what the use of the data is later. And I'll be going over some projects that address each of these areas. We have to collect the data into sufficient mass to make it visible. So in these, if it's very rarefied air, mostly people can't find it, they can't see it. If we can pull it together into like types or index it within federations, then it becomes much more visible to the rest of the science community. If you think about it, that's what Netflix did for providing, now that it might be going to chapter 11, but that's what Netflix did with the internet. It made it easy for people to find the documentaries. There might only be 1,000 people that want to see the documentary, but it was very easy for people to find it and get their hands on it. So we need to do that for science data as well. We have to provide access to the data, but more importantly, we have to enable new research with the data. So it's not enough to just get the data out there. We have to figure out how we're going to use it. And then preserve the data, of course, or better, to make it indispensable. And then everyone will make sure that it's being preserved, and governments will put money into it and those sorts of things. So small data is big science because it's actually high volume. If you measure the area in the curve, the long tail curve, there's a lot of information in there. Information rich, and it has high entropy. So while we know the needs of large data pretty much, not a lot of people have studied the small tail phenomenon, nor have the vendors focused on how they're going to make money in the small tail either. So there's a marketing opportunity there. So my area is biodiversity. So where do we find, as an example, the dark data in biodiversity? So the literature, a lot of the data is embedded there. In biomedical research, people have been working for a while trying to extract the data out of abstracts on what proteins and gene sequences are referenced in the journals. But in many fields, that's not being done. So we have data or information that's sort of lost and invisible within the literature. So how do we get it out? Museum specimens around the world. The United States has about 1 billion, maybe 5 billion natural history museum specimens worldwide. For the most part, they're not digitized, not available, and I'll talk about why that's important. Field notes, scientists collect and write those, but they're often in paper or electronic proprietary formats in their disk drives, and therefore not available to us, making it very difficult to replicate science. There are experimental and unexperimental data sets sitting around on people's hard drives on their laptops. My laptop died yesterday afternoon. I'm undergoing CPU withdrawal. But I do have my smartphone, so it makes me feel comfortable knowing there's a CPU in there. We have citizen observations. Since the For the last several hundred years, people have been walking around in their environments and collecting data. David Thoreau had a diary that he carried, and in that diary wrote down when the flowers were blooming in the area that he was at the particular time, such as around Walden Pond. And it turns out that that's very important for us. That's a very small data set, and a lot of his followers started doing the same thing. They carried diaries, wrote down that information about when the first flowers were blooming in the spring. Well, under climate change, we would like to know from 200 years ago when were flowers first blooming for each of the different species. And from that, we can combine it with the big data that we have from our satellites and weather modeling apparatus. That small data set can take us a long way to projecting back in time what things were like and help us to project into the future as well. Okay, so what is dark data good for? I gave you a preview of that. Things like ecological niche modeling. So the ability to take ground truth data about where species are now or where species were in the past, combine it with our weather data, and predict where the area that species are in now, but more importantly, where the species will be later as rainfall changes, as temperature changes, as other things change. But we only have, most of the data is dark. Most of the observation data is still invisible. So we have climate change. We need things like taxonomic name recognitions required in the literature. It's very difficult. It turns out that you may have been told in grade school that either Linnaeus worked out the names of all things, so that's been taken care of. That's not quite true, that we keep revising the names of everything in biology at a great rate. Or you're told that Adam did it, or at least Adam was told to name everything. And if he did, he lost it. He lost the record, and it's dark data too. So we need to have mechanisms for identifying the names of species and in broad context, both in literature and among the scientists themselves. Literature search support, let's get to that, so tools, phenology and phenological change. So that's cycles of life. So blooming, when things are born season-wise, when they set seed, all those sorts of things. And those are changing, but we have very little data, but we can't use satellites to do it. We need many, many people on the ground collecting information to do that for us. And things like food web, and interactions of life on Earth. So to solve some of these problems, we need cyber infrastructure support for data collection of small data sets, storage, access, processing, communication, training, and institutions. So just like we do for big data, we need all of those things for these distributed small data sets or small science. So we have institutionalization of e-research. We started on the left-hand side of the curve. Now we should be migrating to the right-hand side of the curve. So we need tools for science, and the business of science needs to be seamlessly integrated with good data curation and professional practice. I think at the left-hand side of the curve, we get that, and that's partly because we're spending a lot of money for the instruments. So everyone knows that when you get the data off the instrument, you have to keep it and preserve it and make it available to a lot of people. In small science, that's harder because the instrument is often a human or some small data gathering device that hasn't been standardized. So when the person does their science, it's not automatic that the data gets stored anywhere that anyone can get at it, but it should be. Also, if we think of data as just being stored in a repository and our job is done, this chart by Nova is showing sort of the distribution of information in society based on the degree of social connectivity and information connectivity. And you see databases are down there on the bottom left. But as the world becomes more interconnected and scientists can be more interconnected and work with each other possibilities exist. So we have the meta web on the top right-hand corner. Top right-hand is always good. You don't want to be on the left bottom. And with the goal of this thing called the global brain. How do we get there? How do we get very integrated data and social integration at the same time? What I want to argue is that repositories are down here on the bottom left-hand corner with the databases, very close. But what we really want in scientific workflows is to be moving up to the top right. So we want to take all these distributed small science people and interconnect them, interconnect their data, and interconnect them socially so that we have larger piles of interconnected data to do new kinds of science. So how do we get there? So here's some different people working in different environments generating their data. Actually, I have some big data examples out there in computational science, people working on the left. And each of them are creating their own data sets, and we see some of the data leaking out the bottom of their data buckets there. And we think that we have solved that. My son works in computer animation and graphics, so I can ask him to make those things for me. So now we look at, well, we solved the problem. We throw the data, some of the data, over a wall. Our data librarian or data scientist sticks it in the nice, safe data repository where it's all saved for us. But the trouble is it's locked up there, and how do we get it back out? And then we think that we solve it by putting in this big interconnected network and throw the data back and make it available to all the scientists. I'd say that's a bad idea. Well, it's better, but not the best idea. What we should really be doing is making the data scientist invisible, sort of moving into the background behind the scientist, and have the scientists, when they perform their work, have it somewhat seamlessly integrate into the network or into the cloud. So it's automatically available without a data scientist or a data manager sitting between the scientist and the curation of the data. That means that we have to create app as repository. We have to create applications of science that automatically shift the data from the desktop or the lab where people are working and move it straight to the cloud without the scientist having to do anything new as far as they're concerned. And that's particularly true for small science. So let's look at what the scientist is doing. So we have our chemist here in the lab. The chemist, between them and the data, is a set of applications. We have statistical packages, sensors observing temperature and other chemical reaction properties. We have the lab notebook, which might be online or on paper, actually still mostly on paper. And that some of that makes it into their personal data store. So what we want to do is instead have them working in the lab, move the data through shared online resources. So create cloud-enabled apps, virtual applications. Instead of having it run on their own computer, have it run on the cloud, or if it is running on their own computer, have it integrated so that the data is moving across to be stored in a different location. So if their computer crashes, they still have all their data sort of automatically. I did have my slide presentation preserved 5 minutes before my computer crashed, so we still have it today. And then once the data is there, we have all of these other applications. We have, for education, for the farmer, whoever can get access to the data pretty seamlessly, and we should all be very happy, and it's all happy in the Shire if we set up things like that. Except I want to remember, those of you that are old enough may remember the good, bad old days of the mainframe computers, and when the computer overlords kept access to the computers for us. So there was a priesthood that controlled the computer, and you would go in and beg them to take your cards and run it through the readers and get a process done. And it really created a bottleneck in science because of the computer overlords keeping access. And we want to be very careful that that doesn't happen again, just because we've moved things to the cloud. So I just want to warn you here that this is what could be happening. That Sauron and our cloud computing is the One Ring. It looks very powerful and we want to use it, but we have to be very careful because Sauron might actually have control. So just a moral lesson. So all of you know about this is the data repurposing chart. So this is from 2006, just from a workshop. So it's how do we recycle our data, look into the science process, the original creation of the data, and then put it out and have it be able to recycle back in to be reused by everyone. So I'm going to switch here to some of the applications that are moving in this sort of direction. How much time do I have? I didn't check. Okay. Oh, good. Um, so one that I was involved with first at NSF, well, this is a good story, how the world turns. I put in a proposal for the Plant Science Cyber Infrastructure Center, part of a team that became the runners-up to become what became iPlant. We lost the grant, and I decided I would go work at NSF instead, since we didn't get that really big grant. And turns out I became the project manager for the iPlant Plant Science Collaborative from NSF. So this is cyber infrastructure for support for challenges in biology, but focused on the plant sciences. And the objective of that was to build cyber infrastructure that would allow scientists to answer ground challenges that they could not have answered in their own labs, with their own computer resources, with their own software applications. So what was recognized is that there are many scientists being distributed, thousands of them, working on similar problems in their own labs, and because of that, we're getting only incremental advances. Incremental advances are good, but if we created a pool and created large, high-power computing resources that were tailored to grand challenge needs in plant science, that we could get a lot further. So the Plant Science Cyber Infrastructure Center housed a number of places, but mostly now at the University of Arizona, set up the task of asking the community, what are your challenges, and then brought the data scientists and the computational scientists into the same room with the plant scientists and tried to work out what exactly they needed. And in the process, what they ended up doing was creating large repositories of data where there used to be many fragmented data sets. And then we could ask much larger questions, both because we had greater compute, but also because we had better algorithms, and we were pooling the data sets together. So I think we can skip the history, but this started back in 2008. So the central challenge is, how do we create cyber infrastructure to answer grand challenge questions? So we can do a similar thing, I think, with many of the small science arenas. So if we're looking at biodiversity, for example, we can ask, what's the grand challenge? And then use those grand challenges to bring together the community and give them resources that they could only get if they participate in a large integrated network. Remember my chart that showed social integration and data integration, or information integration. So figure out what those problems are that are solvable at the top right-hand side of the chart, and then invest in the production of algorithms and applications in that region to pull the scientists in and get them collaborating. So get community buy-in for the vision. So these are just title slides from PIs doing other presentations. I'm borrowing everyone's materials here. So here's the basic architecture for iPlant, and I think it works for a lot of small science applications as well. What you do is you provide an application or a backbone, cyber infrastructure backbone, where you have algorithms that are available to the scientists wherever they are, and the bench scientists go through several layers to get access to that data with their applications. So they don't have to worry about the actual structure of the data that's behind the scenes. They shouldn't, or their graduate students shouldn't be building their own MySQL databases or other applications like they do now. Instead, they have portals and access to data, and as they work on things, it gets uploaded and downloaded from their applications directly. So discovery environment is the idea that we create like a portal, and the portal gives you views to the data that's available and the computations that are available. Also gives you the power to add your own scripts, your own information to that set, your own data plus your own algorithms. And in that discovery environment, you can do new science. But at the same time, you're contributing to everyone else's science because your data is being pulled down and your applications are being made available to everyone else at the same time instead of just staying in your local environment. These are just some of the grand challenges that are being attempted. So the connection between genotype and phenotype. So how do we go from the gene representation? We're getting very good at getting the gene sequence. But what we're not very good at is understanding what the expression of those genes is. and how that impacts the production of proteins in plants and those sorts of things that are critical for us. Understanding, so that's one of the challenges that was adopted by the community to begin with. The tree of life is what are the phylogenetic relationships between species. It turns out that on small computers, you can't calculate easily over 100 or 200 relationships from the gene sequences. What are the ancestral relationships between species? There are millions of species on Earth. If we want to solve that problem, what we need to do is get all of the small data from many, many researchers representing gene sequences across large assortment of taxonomic groups, and then we suddenly need HPC to solve the problem, to go in the thousands or tens of thousands. So by doing, that's what's being tackled at iPlant right now. Well, they started for plants, but it turns out that the zoologists and other people can use the same architecture, which was pretty much planned from the beginning. And they have put up a taxonomic name resolution service, which people here, unless you're in, how many people here in biology? Probably a lot of people in physics. Yeah, usually I talk to biology crowds, so it's kind of odd to have not so many biologists here. The Biodiversity Heritage, I lost a word. The Biodiversity Heritage Library is an example of trying to take dark data and make it available to the masses. It originally was a consortium of museums in the United States, the UK, and then very soon after Europe joined in. Now China, Brazil, and Australia have joined into BHL, Biodiversity Heritage Library. Currently they have 34 million pages of digitized text and images that were originally held in the museums. They started with materials that were hard to get, so they could be distributed around the world. So it's a great resource. I looked last night, right before my computer crashed, and found this 1900 publication, Australian Bird Eggs and Nests, here in Melbourne. Oops. And the kind of data that we want to pull out, dark data. This is the list of the species and eggs that were available in that particular collection in 1900. So we'd really like to know, well, where are the eggs now? And where were they from? What was the genus distribution of them in this particular collection that was held here in Melbourne? So how do we pull that out from 34 million pages? And the goal is more like 100 million pages now. How do we pull that out? And that's just not copyright material. Still trying to work out agreements of what do we do for the copyrighted material. So that's a large challenge. It's sort of distributed data right now, but it becomes a big data issue, high compute HPC issue, once we start pulling it all together. So mobilizing data locked in paper. Very proud of an old doctoral student of mine. Well, she's not that old yet. Doctoral student of mine working on fine-grained semantic markup of descriptive data in biodiversity domains. So what she's working on is pulling out morphological characteristics from this literature. So going into the literature, looking at the natural language descriptions of species, and then changing that natural language description into a formal structure, which allows us to do things like creative electronic interactive keys for identifying species, those sorts of things. So freeing the data, the dark data, and bringing it to light and available. And for that, you need natural language processing, machine learning, large computers, those sorts of things. Another issue we have is data interlinking. So once we have this data extracted, it's very heterogeneous. Unlike a lot of big data sets, where we know all the images coming off the satellite have pretty much the same format, we know what's in them, we are looking for slight variations in the data set. In small science, it's different. We have a lot of very disparate data sets. And what we want to look for is is there overlap? So overlap occurs in things like scientific name. So one person might be studying the breeding behavior of a species, another one has collected some genomics on the species, but it's very distributed. How do we pull together everything that we know about the species? through that kind of interlinking, through scientific name, for example, particularly under the constraint that scientific names have changed over the last 200 years. So here we have one of the projects I'm working on. It's not called the World Mind, but that's in the top, near the top right-hand corner of that graph I showed you earlier on. We're only on version 0.01b, so it'll be quite a while before we get to the operating version. But nonetheless, we have this project. It's Biological Science Collection Tracking, or BICYCLE. In jesting, we use triple stores. So the triple store creator is the tricycle. So what we have is, how do we take biological data from disparate data sets and bring them all together? So what approach can we take to interlink this data? So it should be that you could look at a museum specimen in a collection and say, tell me everything that you know about that specimen. And it should reach into the literature. It should reach into GenBank. It should reach into our observation networks of citizen scientists where it's been seen, and pull all the data back. Right now, we can't do that. So how do we do it? This is also called Gustav's big problem. Well, we'll find out who Gustav is in a while. I have many, many collaborators on this project listed here. So it's funded 2010 through 2014, many partners all over the place. Since it's a data integration issue. To make it interesting to this crowd, I decided to bring up an example of the agave. First, because I just moved to Arizona and agave suddenly became very important to me, because it's about the only thing that grows in my yard. So if we have an agave, we might have specimens distributed in different museums around the world. So in Paris and in Nairobi and Missouri Botanical Garden. And they might be clonal. So often when botanists are collecting information, what they do, or specimens, is cut off several pieces of the same plant, and then for safekeeping, distribute the plant around the world. So because often the museums or the specimens are destroyed. So for example, the Berlin botanical collection was destroyed during the war. And so all of that research work was sort of lost. So botanists are very careful to distribute around the world. Lots of copies make things safe. Lots. But it also means that the data becomes dissociated. So as people do research on the individual items, we forget about the interlinking, or at least in the past, there was no easy way to do it. So this agave may have, mezcal is very important agave because it makes a good tequila-like beverage. So we can have a determination of the species originally happening at one museum, but there's no interlinking. So the other museums aren't told that there's been a new determination. Determination means a new name has been assigned to the species. The other museums are not told. There might be an entry made from one of the other museums into GenBank. The other museums are not told. More importantly, there's a moth that eats the agave and therefore threatens our tequila supply. And we need to know, if that parasitic relationship is discovered in the literature and presented, then people around the world should know right away to protect the tequila supply. And if someone sees that there's a crossover, if the predator is moving to a new species, we should really know about it. So how do we do that? Well, we can look at Facebook. Remember we said social integration is an important thing. So John Deck is the lead developer programmer on this, or data scientist, so to speak. And what he did, he has an example here of his interlinking on Facebook. And this is the relationship network that's automatically, not automatically, but there's a federation of the social media that have agreed on the metadata format for representation of knowledge for information that's in LinkedIn, Facebook, and other sources. So you can create triple stores pretty easily from those data sets using that data standard and develop maps like this, which is the interrelationship of people. So can we use that sort of technology to interrelate the science data that we have, or Gustav's big problem? So Gustav works in the Morea project, on an island in the South Pacific. And he generates a lot of data. So so that's a picture of the island from above. There's an all-taxa survey being done of the island. All-taxa meaning they're trying to identify all the species that exist on the island. So many, many thousands of species on the island. And there are many dozens or hundreds, if you count the people working not on the island, people working on this project to do the identification. And the data is going into many different data repositories. So these are just lists. Some of it's going to the Smithsonian, Florida Museum, other places, depending on the type of data, CalPhotos for image data, MorphBank for morphological description in images. So just many, many data sets are data is being thrown out of this island and distributed around the world. But then Gustav has to pull it all back together again, and people that aren't even on the island have to pull it all back together again, creating a nightmare for him. So if we apply, what we really want to do is create a network of data. So as all of this information is collected, and we want to interconnect it independent of what database it's stored in right now. So this is just listing the kinds of information. So we want to create an ontology or data representations that talk about what's the data type, what's the interlinking between them. So species name, or more importantly, for every event gets a GUID, a global unique identifier. So the collection event has a unique identifier. Any specimen that is generated has a unique identifier. And then in the triple store, what we collect is the relationship between each of those GUIDs, each of those global unique identifiers. And from that, we can create sort of a social network of the interrelationships of events and data that's generated from the science that's taking place. So I just left that project and I'm going to another one, which I also competed for the lead of, and I didn't get that either. So I'm very sad. But I get to collaborate on the back end on these. So this is advanced digitization of biological collections. So in the United States, it was recognized through very good politics. Judith Skog did a great job of bringing this together, that 5 to 10% of our collections are available online in the United States, and we're near the forefront of digitizing the collections and making them available on a global framework. So there's an initiative has started creating a hub, so a central computing center, so that each of the thousands of museums around the United States and indeed around the world will have a central resource or cyber infrastructure, much like iPlant, that will have a set of tools that enables the scientists working in each of those individual museums to access facilities they couldn't get on their own servers in their own places. Many museums within universities in the United States and a lot of parts of the world have, staff-wise, only have a curator that's assigned part-time. And generally, they don't have a hardware budget. So we need a mechanism to sort of move that off into the cloud, provide the data management resources as a shared resource in the Cyber Infrastructure Center, in this case running in Florida, and then train them and create the institutions so that the data can move in relatively seamlessly. So the hub is about $750,000 investment, and then each year there are a set of thematic hubs coming out, or grand challenges. So the scientists working in biodiversity, or anyone that uses collections data, are asked, what are the big science questions that you could answer that you couldn't have answered by yourself? So you're taking all of the sort of small science things, getting them into a room, get them to talk to each other, and hang $2 million out the window and say, okay, you can have this if you can stand on each other's shoulders to reach the $2 million. So they create grand challenge themes like what's going to be the change in food production at the vegetation level for the southwest of the United States as the monsoons change their distribution within that region. And then how can we use science collections, biological science collections, to inform that? Well, it turns out we can look back in time a couple hundred years in the collections to see how species distributions have changed in the last 200 years. We can look at other parts of the world that have dry monsoon environments and see how the plant distributions have changed there for analogous species, and then project back to the southwest of the United States under climate change scenarios and predict what the changes are there. And that gives us motivation to focus on which specimens should be digitized and what data do we have to make sure are digitized within those collections. So it's a funding structure, I think, that helps to bring this data together. Luckily, I put a slide in on nanotechnology. Nanotechnology is very important. But one of the things that was very successful early on was the creation of the Nano Hub. So the Nano Hub was one of the first virtual environments, successfully created virtual environments, that provide tools, data, and compute tools for nano research, that people could log in, share their information, run large-scale computations in a relatively seamless environment so that each scientist didn't have to learn how to run these algorithms themselves or have their graduate students do it. You still have to do a lot of that work, but at least you have your one step up in the arena. So many other scientists could do the same thing. Create, the Nano Hub actually has been rolled out as one hub, and it can be ported out to other environments and provide links to HPC for other sciences. So near the end here, I want to point out the importance of citizen science. Anyone here ever participated in a citizen science project? Oh, a few people have, quite a few. Okay, very good. So the idea is that a lot of science questions can't be answered by our satellites or by individual science researchers. We need a lot of feet on the ground, eyes looking around, collecting the information. Audubon bird count, Christmas bird count, Doomsday in the UK. Those different projects go on because you get lots of scientists putting data in. That's been happening for a couple of hundred years at least, that people collect information about the environment, but it's not standardized. So it's very difficult to get that data up and shared. But we can create infrastructure for doing that. As data scientists, we can create standardization, validation methods, because there is bad data coming in from the citizen scientists, as there's bad data from real scientists. Put in feedback mechanisms, make sure the data is used in a proper format. How do we bring that together? This is just one example I was using a couple of weeks ago, Project NOAA. So what they've done is created an app is repository, that runs on your smartphone. That's here in my pocket, my only connection to CPUs right now. And you could take it into the field, use the GPS unit. In this case, we were doing a biodiversity blitz of the Saguaro National Park. That's very close to my home. Biodiversity blitz, you have 24 hours to identify all the species you can in the area. So you bring in a whole bunch of scientists, a whole bunch of citizens and school kids and other people, and go through the landscape trying to identify everything. I used the software app from Project NOAA to take a picture of a royal horned lizard during the survey. You take a photograph, it goes up into a central repository along with the GPS coordinates, who did the identification of it for later data validation. During the project, scientists were watching the data feeds coming in. If there were unidentified species, they could look at the photograph and try to do the ID, or just accept the IDs that were coming in from the field for the species as they approach. And then you see the mapping happening on the right. So live, the people participating in the project are getting feedback to spur them on to do further data collection because they can be competitive and see how many spots they can get on the map. So Project NOAA gives you little merit badges for how many taxonomic groups you have identified, how many species you've identified, all of that, and make it very exciting and fun. But that means people have standardized the representation of that. This leads into some big, important science. So I just wanted to point out one of those projects we funded out of NSF. RAPID is a program for providing funding within NSF when there's sort of an emergency, where carefully placing money very quickly to scientists for a very important problem will get us somewhere. We can't wait for the normal review process. We had this small problem in the United States that someone poked a hole in an oil pipe, or actually in a reservoir, and started leaking oil into the Gulf of Mexico. And using a citizen science project, Stephen Kelling was already gathering bird data around the region with observers. So he was able to call out to the citizen science network and say, we have this oil spill, will you help me? And he was able to, brown pelicans are endangered species, and he was able within days to start creating maps of where are the brown pelicans now and where's the spill now, and therefore what endangered individuals are going to be hit by the oil as it approaches the birds. That would not have been possible just using the regular old scientists. Having the citizen science was critical, and having the central repository. So there was a standard way to submit their data, validate their data, put it into a central location, visualize it on these maps, all live. Most of it was in place before the spill took place. So it's sort of big science coming out of this small science. We can skip filtered push. I'm down to 5 minutes or so. Maybe what I'll do is I'll talk about map of life briefly, and then I'll probably stop. The issue is, on the left, we have our satellites, topography data coming in. The level of we're looking at the level of resolution. So is it down to a kilometer? Is it down to 100 meters resolution? Land cover is down to below 1 kilometer resolution. But for species distributions, we have a gap. We don't know. We have several individual records, point records, but we can't map at a high level of precision where the species are now, and therefore we can't predict what the impact's going to be under climate change or land use change if we just dig up an area and put houses there or something. So how do we fill the gap? This project, instead of, it used to be that individual scientists working on the individual species would do a distribution map, make their best guess at what the distribution of a species is. What this project is doing is taking those same maps, making them available interactively, pulling in data from species checklists, from the museum data, from existing species distributions, overlaying them, showing where the discrepancies are, and then having scientists interactively refine the maps. So instead of just having one publication and there's the map, it becomes a dynamic object that's refined over time and gets better and better as a shared resource among everyone. And this is just showing some of the maps that are being generated. This is for a cougar or puma distribution, and the project based on observations and based on projections. I think I'll skip VertNet. VertNet is just a motivation mechanism for getting museums to share their data. A success story is 10 years ago, many museums said, I'm not sharing my museum data. People come into our door and look at our museums, and that's how we make our money, because they come in the door. So we're not going to put our data online because then people will stop coming in. It turns out that when they start putting their data online, they started getting more money. So it started off, VertNet started off in 1999, a small set of early adopters. And what happened is the early adopters started getting more money because they were able to show, VertNet kept track of their data usage. So they did data citation essentially, so that the providers of information were able to go back to the funders and say, look at how much my data is being used. The people that weren't sharing their data couldn't do that. So what started happening is the data sharers started getting more money than the non-sharers. And now you see there's a big backlog of people trying to get on VertNet to share their data. So it's sort of a success story, and so much so that they can't keep up with the demand to put new members online. There's no time to talk about the architecture, but you can ask me after. It'll be available on the web. Data One is an important example in the United States. People know about the DataNet projects in the United States. So the United States is spending about $100 million on DataNet to deal with the data deluge. So a small number of $20 million projects, I get 5, that will address the data sharing issue. And indeed, one of those this is an example from one of their projects. What they're doing is taking R, very popular statistical package, and interconnecting it with the central data stores that are being created by Data One with the use of GWIDs and other things, global unique identifiers, so that as people do their statistical applications, they're automatically integrated on the cloud instead of on their own processors. And they also get the added advantage that the compute can happen on the cloud, not just on their own compute resources. And just other, so I'll close with why libraries. I'm the director of a School of Information Resources and Library Science, so I have to put in a plug for librarians. We have a long history of managing the information for society. And we have many of the skill sets that are needed to do long-term data preservation. We invented things like name indexes, card catalogs, or organization of books, the Dewey Decimal System, MARC records, all of those sorts of things. And that's just moving now into the 21st century. So we have the skills that we need. We're long-lived institutions. If you give these data to computer science departments, for example, they're not long-lived, where you can trust pretty much that the library will be there forever, at least as much as we trust our journal materials, and large overlap with museums and archives that exist globally already. So I think this is just from one of the reports from NSF, looking at the tasks that are needed for management, long-lived management of data, and the different roles that are filled in, including from libraries. So we have, in the data lifecycle, plan, curate, keep, dispose, and then on management side, we have access, document, organize, and protect. So all of those things have to be managed. I started out the talk listing those. But what I'm arguing in this talk is that we need application developers or data scientists to be developing applications that automatically integrate the data back into the repositories in a relatively seamless fashion. So instead of writing applications that write to the disk, we should be writing applications that standardize data and write it out to the cloud and to the central repositories. And I will leave it at that.
Thank you, speaking. Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, Brian. That was a tour de force of almost every part, I think, of the e-research agenda that we have today, and I hope sets the scene very strongly for many of the different themes and many of the different NCRIS and super science projects that we've been talking about, which all contribute to that system, for the ecosystem, I think, that Brian has been talking about. So thank you again, Brian, and perhaps you just join me in thanking Brian again for that excellent presentation.